Bueno, a todo esto no he presentado a Peter. Peter es el director del Joukowsky Institute de la Universidad de Brown, en Estados Unidos. Tiene una larga trayectoria en arqueología, además conoce diferentes ámbitos historiográficos, porque ha sido profesor en... bueno, él es de origen neerlandés y ha impartido clases en la Universidad de Glasgow y ahora en la Academia Norteamericana. Como os decía, es uno de los pioneros en aplicar estas perspectivas a la arqueología clásica, diría. Él me puntualizará mejor en mis palabras. Y realmente, en cierta medida, también este workshop gira en torno a que lo teníamos cerca. Está haciendo una estancia ahora mismo en la Pompeu Fabra en Barcelona y queríamos aprovechar la ocasión de poder tenerle con nosotros. Le agradezco mucho que haya venido y cuando quieras, Peter. Qué recasco.
Ok, ¿me sentís bien? ¿Sí? Ok, quería empezar con dos palabras en castellano para agradecer sobre todo a Sergio y Jacoba para la organización, la invitación en primer lugar, y es verdad un placer estar aquí estos días y ver a todos vosotros. Como Sergio ya decía, he preparado la ponencia en inglés, hablo en inglés, pero si tenéis preguntas y después se podría hablar en castellano. Okay, so thank you again in English as well for the invitation here. It's a pleasure to be here. And the title of my presentation is, as you can see, Embedding Connectivity, the Local Practices and the Colonial Connections. And the emphasis of my talk is really going to be, well, as you can see as well, I've put Spanish Castilian titles on the PowerPoint, is really going to be on the network side of things. But all of that sort of understood with, within the sort of the bigger picture of colonial connections and indeed post-colonial theory. I'm not going to sort of talk too much about that in detail itself, focusing more on a case study to sort of to really to be able to go into some of the details and the subtleties of these contexts. But as we said, sort of I'd be very happy to answer specific questions, or in the discussion we can get into that. So networks, Mediterranean networks, has been a big topic for, well, a couple of decades in Mediterranean archaeology, and it's a sort of map that you see here on the foreground, that these sort of maps are dominant. So large arrows, long lines drawn all over the Mediterranean. And there's also been a lot of discussion and criticism of these sort of approaches. And just to sort of run through some of these very quickly, some of the problems that these kind of approaches present is that they create a certain homogeneity, that they sort of, because of these connections, that the whole Mediterranean was connected, that the whole Mediterranean was also sort of similar. And that's particularly problematic when a lot of those lines concentrate on the so-called classical world. The whole Mediterranean being interconnected is sort of all the same, all very classical from east to west. And that the classical homogeneity really represents the Mediterranean. There's obviously also problems of scale, talking about the entire Mediterranean. Where does that leave the sort of the local perspective and the smaller questions? But the third question is really about critique, is really about questions about connectivity. What do those arrows mean, and how are connections made, and what is the nature of these things? There has been more debate about these as well, and so what you see here is actually sort of an alternative approach that's much more complicated. You see the lines sort of much more intersecting, and it's a different approach, trying to think more about how connections were made and what does it made to say that there were connections, in this case, running from Sardinia to Cyprus. This particular debate was to do with the so-called oxide ingots in the late Bronze Age, and that's what this would be a representation of that, but it's also other objects there. And it is really this last topic, the nature of connections, that I want to sort of talk about in detail. Connectivity, these connections across the Mediterranean, they sort of don't naturally, organically sort of arise from out of nowhere. It's actually people doing things in some places somewhere, and it's really, how does that work? That's what I want to look at more in detail. And it is, all right. It is special objects. I just refer to oxide ingots, but it is also the item that you see here, the so-called incense burner or timiaterion. This is a type that's sort of particularly common in Cyprus and the Levantine coast, but that are found in places like Sardinia, but also central Italy and Sicily and more of those places. Also always in very special contexts. These are very special objects, often, and that's actually the point. Often a lot of these lines that I showed before, or these circles, are based on those particular objects, and those special objects like these incense burners that used to be or often called prestige goods that are the focus of those connections. But there's very few of those objects, and so I think my focus is going to be on Sardinia. That's why I had on my previous map already highlighted the island of Sardinia, and you can see it's black on this map. And this is a sort of more slightly later Iron Age. We're entering into the Iron Age here. That's what I will be concentrating the discussion on here. And this is a distribution map that was published not so long ago about Sardinian pottery on the Iberian Peninsula. And this is the sort of map that shows the problems of talking about connectivity in that sense. What does it mean to have 14 dots on the whole of the Iberian Peninsula and to have the whole island of Sardinia sort of black as one giant dot? And that's not to say that there are no interesting sort of elements here, because one of the interesting elements actually which you cannot get from these dots, but the pottery, the Sardinian pottery, the two examples that you see there, or just the sites, Cadiz, the Calle Canovas, one of the excavations, or the Malaga airport excavations. This is indigenous Sardinian pottery in indigenous, well, not entirely indigenous context on the Iberian Peninsula, but there's a strong Phoenician association with almost all of those dots on the map. And that's not really brought out very clearly by these maps themselves. And sort of the other big question, the thing that I want to sort of say more about, blocking out the whole island of Sardinia as if it were one giant homogeneous site, obviously that doesn't help us very much. So what I want to do really in this talk, in the sort of little less than half an hour that remains for me now, is to sort of drill down in great detail into the sort of the black homogeneity of that of this map that points out Sardinia there. So thinking really about those connections in much more detail. So that's why I'm sort of going to sort of flip immediately into Sardinia and start drilling down in detail. You can see here, the goals that I've set myself for this talk here, and particularly the area we're talking about. So the region here is the west coast of Sardinia, and particularly the central part of the west coast that is centered around, as you can see here, a large wetland area, the Gulf of Oristano, and a sort of an area full of lagoons around it there. And the main site I'll be talking about is this one here, Suraki, San Veromilis. And so what I'm doing here is really to adopt a local and, if you want, indigenous perspective, but I'll prefer to use the term local here, and we could go into that later on as well. There's one more site that I'll be talking about, sort of Monteprama, the one situated here, but just to refer to you, Taros here and this one here as well. These are Phoenician colonial settlements. That's sort of at least the conventional naming of these places. And really what I want to do is, what does it mean to have connections? Did this place have connections with the Iberian Peninsula, or sort of slightly earlier with Cyprus? How did that happen? How did that come? And what was the role, particularly of local people in all of this here? So focusing poner de relieve las prácticas locales, really sort of focusing on local practices. How are connections built from the bottom up, if they are being built in that case? So even if, as I've been saying, pointed out a couple of times, the map of Sardinia, on the map that we looked at before, Sardinia is entirely blocked out. Even if we would have more distinct dots on there, there's still sort of questions. These dots, again, they homogenize everything, and they obscure a whole diversity of sites and of practices to go with it. And I'm going to focus in on the site of Monteprama, sort of this one here, to just show you that difference. So this is the site of Monteprama, which is a burial site. That's sort of to begin with. That's actually not that unusual. That is, burial contexts are those where a lot of those sort of special objects often turn up. But Monteprama is a remarkable site because it is, well, it's more or less unique in Iron Age Sardinia. It's an unusual cemetery because it is made up, as you can see here, a whole long row of individual pit burials, as opposed to the Nuragic, so Bronze Age, Iron Age tradition of communal burials in Sardinia. And it's even more unique in the Iron Age, because the 33 burials that you see, well, a little bit more than 33 that you see here, are more or less the only Iron Age burials that exist, that are known on the whole island of Sardinia for the Iron Age. So that sort of immediately shows that if this were a dot on a distribution map, there's something very special going on here, and we need to understand that better. But at the same time, the statues that you see at the bottom here, first of all, they're life size. These statues are about sort of 1.80 meters, sort of just under 2 meters tall in their entirety. There's 23 of them in total. And the size of these is entirely connected to, is usually associated with the outside world. While there are local connections, I'll be saying more of that in a minute, but it is the size of these statues that this idea of having a monumental, probably row of statues set up is generally being associated with monumental statuary traditions in the Phoenician world, particularly in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. In terms of chronology, I should add, we're talking here about the 8th, possibly the 7th century, but sort of say between late 9th and early 7th century BCE. And again, as I said, the whole site as a whole, because it is so unusual, it is, and close to a colonial site, it is Taros, it is usually sort of very much attributed to interaction. This sort of special nature of the site is attributed to the special interactions with the outside world. But at the same time, what is really important is the very strong local connections. The iconography of the statues, in fact, is entirely local. The little bronze statuette there, it's just about 20 centimeters tall, so it's very small. But you can see in some of the details, but also in the larger, these are the iconography of the large statues, the Monteprama statues, is very much the same iconography as those little bronze statuettes, of which several, well, close to 1,000 or so are known across the island, and that are distinctively Sardinian Nuragic. What is unusual, again, is the size of these statues and their execution in stone. Sort of stone statuary is not something that's otherwise known in the entire West Mediterranean, really, at this time. But the same strong local connections is also the individual pit burials, despite their uniqueness. There is the Monteprama cemetery in the 8th century, does not come falling out of the air. There was already 200 or 300 years of individual burials going on, a small number, at this same place. And the final thing that should be added here, the representations, as you could see here, well, just about see here. The iconography is very much that of a so-called warrior iconography. It's about archers, boxers, but particularly archers are well represented there. And the human remains are also those of young men, almost entirely. So there is sort of, it's a very special and not at all representative average of the population there. So all of this to emphasize that if Monteprama is an important site that sort of underscores the connections of Iron Age Sardinia with the outside world, then it is, it's a sort of very special and unusual place, and it's not definitely that involves a large part. It's not something that seems to involve a large part of the population. So it's that sort of local distinctions, trying to sort of tease out to understand what's going on at those places. All right, and sort of, sorry, forgetting one point here. I want to emphasize again, this sort of the iconography is very much Sardinian, but the execution, the size, but also the stone carving to some extent is not something that has parallels on the island. It is something that's sort of been generally connected to the Eastern Phoenician world. So all of this is good reason to look sort of more in detail at local sites and to look at sort of these local connections. So the discussions of connectivity, attention is usually focused on those connections I've been saying before, the dots on the map that are usually seen as the results, where those connections come into. I actually want to, as the endpoints where the items, that sort of signal those connections ended up as they moved across the Mediterranean. But sort of what I want to do here is actually turn this upside down, look at the dots, look at the places where those connections usually are assumed to end up. I want to sort of look at those places as places where the connections are actually begun, where those connections are being constructed. So rather than an endpoint, I want to look at them as a starting point. And the implication is, if we can understand, if we can look at them in more detail at these sites, and understand how those connections were made, because if these connections were made as part of the everyday lives of people, their daily routines and their work, then we can sort of get a better understanding of the impact of those connections and the role of those connections within local life. So with that, I want to focus my attention on the site of Suraki. It's an excavation that I've been co-directing with Alfonso Stiglitz in Sardinia for the last sort of just over 10 years. Thanks, I think, with our excavations, we found sort of very much, one of the reasons to go and work there are some of the materials that you actually show here. You can see one of those incense burners that actually sort of has been found at this site here, but also a fair amount of Phoenician pottery that was exactly at what is an indigenous local site. And that is precisely sort of the context to think more about what could be a local node. So I'll begin with a few words about Suraki itself. Here you see an aerial view of the site. So what is the sort of the core of the site here? There's a couple of large towers you see just about one point here. There's more sort of central towers here that we know very little about. What you see here is an external defensive wall which originally had 10 towers, and you can see 6 and the 7th somewhere here about, that have been preserved really well. Our excavations have been taking place, just as you can see on this photo as well, just outside those defensive walls, not within this large structure here itself. And we have a reasonably good idea what those nuraghi looked like because of a series of miniatures that exist and that emphasize these towers rising up highly. And so in this case, because of later destructions and so on, actually we don't have that sort of very vertical representation that you see very much in this here. So what's important in our excavations, so we've been concentrating on that outside wall, and here you see that conventional wisdom has that these walls date to the late Bronze Age, and they're usually sort of 11th, 10th century or so on. But digging down to the foundations of this context here, what we actually found that these were constructed at the external defenses were constructed sort of in the very, very early, the very end of the 8th century, very early 7th century BC, so quite a bit later. But it's not just the chronology that, which takes us right in the period that we're interested in here, the Iron Age. But really what's been even more remarkable is not that these defenses, the conventional defenses, these defensive walls, were accompanied by something sort of quite different that you can see here, this part, and visible in this section here, a large ditch or a moat, a defensive ditch that sort of was built in tandem contemporaneously with the construction of these defensive towers and outside wall. This ditch was dug simply as a ditch dug out in the soil, and in the second moment, a little bit later, 2 stone embankments were constructed, and that sort of stratigraphically these are sort of all tied together. What's important here, this ditch is, that's why I'm bringing it up, is there's no parallels for these in Sardinia. These ditches, defensive ditches, were not part of conventional Sardinian nuragic Bronze Age, Iron Age architecture, and there's no parallels for these. The stonework, though, of the defensive wall itself, but also of these embankments, is clearly nuragic. It's sort of local stone masons who built this structure. we've continued to work on this for quite some while. So this area E here, this is where we first encountered the ditch, and that's what in the photos that I just showed you. Geophysical work and a second excavation trench up here actually sort of demonstrate that this really was a ditch that goes around the nuraghe in large part. These sort of ditches, as I said, are practically unheard, are unheard of. Otherwise, in Sardinia, it's not. You need to go to the Middle Ages to find that sort of large moats. But they are not unknown in the western part of the Mediterranean, and they're a key part, a very common part of Phoenician defensive architecture in the Near East itself, in North Africa. There's some example in possible example in Carthage, but especially on the Iberian Peninsula. And the ditch that you see here is, as I've noted there, Cabezo Pequeño de los Estaños, just south of Alicante, which is a Phoenician colonial context. But there are others in indigenous context, Iron Age context, going up the Valencian and the Catalan coast, sort of quite a bit north into Catalonia. Chronologies ranging, in this case, Cabezo Pequeño, where in the 8th, 7th century, sort of roughly same chronology. Further up in Catalonia, there's a little bit later, they're running into the 6th century, but there's now 7th century phases coming out there as well. And so what's interesting here in terms of our discussion is that we're about connections. So we're seeing here constructions being built, but by local sort of craft workers, with local techniques. In the cemetery, at Monteprama, these large-scale statues that draw on local iconography, but that are sort of, again, executed in ways that are unheard of in the island. And that's sort of the local parallel between these two sites. But there's more at Suraki, and a little bit further, and you can see that on the situation map. So these are the two areas where we found a ditch around, and just at a little distance, a little further away, where we opened a second area, which turned out to be a settlement area, sort of, which again is traditionally what these large nuraghe in Sardinia. These are sort of these large defensive towers, but they're always accompanied. The large ones are always accompanied by a settlement area. Almost against the walls or at a short distance, and that's what we found here as well. What was different in this case, and just let me check my notes. What's different in this case is that we found traces of nuragic settlement, sort of at a fairly deep level here, and that ended up, this area was continuously inhabited until at least into the 4th century BCE, which takes us well into the sort of Punic classical colonial period, if you want. And particularly you can see here the rectangular architecture of a Phoenician style house. But what was remarkable, what we found, is this sort of semi-round house that you see here much more in detail. This has, again, sort of echoes, reworks late Bronze Age architecture in the nuragic world, the so-called round meeting huts, which would be communal spaces, semi-public, or public you might call them. This has a lot of elements. There's two little altars that were found in here. But what was made this one sort of different is the upper part of the building. Well, first of all, I say what makes it different is oval rather than round, but the upper part that it was made in mud bricks that you see here, and also sort of with a flat roof, again made of mud and wood, and which a fire of part of it preserved that very well. And upper construction in mud brick and flat roofs are typical Phoenician architectural styles that were combined with this very sort of local tradition house. The objects in this house are sort of very unusual. One of the things we did not find in this house, there were no hearths in there, so it's not a regular domestic space, but it was also unusual objects, a lot of import material, Phoenician, Etruscan, Bucaro material, and this is indigenous Iron Age pottery, but sort of heavily decorated of a special type. And these are those two sort of so-called altars, which might not be the best term, but at least sort of unusual items there. And this continues then there's a direct stratigraphic and occupation continuity. This area, that oval building, is at the end of the 6th century, is built over and turned into a domestic space that is entirely Phoenician, as you can see in this building. This is the kind of Phoenician house that you'd expect to find in the sort of regular Phoenician settlements in Sardinia or here in the south of the Iberian Peninsula. And that continues sort of right away, fully transformed into a Phoenician settlement at this time. So if you just look at the architecture of these excavations, you sort of get to see this full transformation, but that's not the bigger picture. When you zoom out a little bit, this is a reconstruction of that particular area. The Phoenician house would be sort of this one here. It is the Nuraga was still standing there at just sort of some 50 meters from there. In this drawing, we still have the ditch open, but that probably would have been backfilled. I'll say a little bit more about that. Just about have time. And so we have really new kind of spaces that come into being that combine the traditional architecture with these very colonial Phoenician style houses. The ditch that I sort of talked about, so I talked about as a defensive ditch, sort of from the 7th century, after about less than a century, sort of at the end of the 7th century, perhaps the beginning of the 6th century, which incidentally is sort of the same time that that oval house was being built over by a Phoenician house. We find that the ditch was no longer being used as a ditch, most of all, but just as a dump. And lots of domestic trash was dumped in it, huge amounts of animal bone, and you can see here being selected by Damian Aramis, who's been responsible for overseeing and largely carrying out the analysis of the zoological material, and tons of pottery, including very sort of special imported materials. And you know, I'll just throw here some numbers, but what sort of these numbers most of all show, this is really domestic remains. There's quite a number of butchering marks on this pottery as well. So this is just household trash being dumped there. This table, I don't expect you to look at it in detail, but what I wanted to highlight here is there is a remarkable aspect here, that is the bovino, the cattle being present here, which is throughout the sequence, which runs, you can see here, throughout the sort of much of the millennium. There's a large representation of cattle that remains, which is unusual in Phoenician, Punic, or those later classical contexts, which is in fact, it is a characteristic of the much earlier Nuragic dietary patterns. And that is something that sort of, what we can see from these numbers here, that sort of is maintained throughout that period, a continuity. And that is the important point I want to emphasize here, a continuity that is being shared among the entire community. This is not just a small elite group or a few people being involved here, but actually the whole community. What we also did with the bulk of the pottery from that ditch, from that dump, is actually, although there were some really special imported pieces, the bulk was local pottery, of course, and we did a fabric study of, as you can see, almost 19,000, a little over 18,000 fragments to sort of look at in detail. And what we got out of there, and again, I'm not going into the detail, but what you see here is the main local clay, and the main point was the main local clay remained in use throughout the first millennium, more or less, but it was gradually being worked in a different way. So these first two lines, fabric 1A and B, and this is sort of Nuragic style pottery being produced in a way. Gradually that becomes less, and then this new way of fabric 1C, which is the same clay, but it is being prepared slightly differently, and most of all is being fired to a higher temperature, and a potter's wheel is being used to construct the vessels in that. So it's the same clay, but it's artisans with different techniques that are working that material. And again, you can see by the 6th century, that's more or less the inflection point when that new style of pottery is sort of taking over in the site. But although, of course, it's not the pottery taking over, it is, and again, that's the point that I want to emphasize, it's the local community, the people here, it's the local production, but also the local people consuming this pottery that becomes dominant, and that sort of start using much more this style of pottery. But again, this is not a small this is everyday use pottery. This is local production. This is not prestige goods or anything like that. So I've run very quickly through a lot of details, and I said I just wanted to show you the variation within the site, and with these last two slides, I'm coming to a couple of conclusions, focusing on the 7th century again. And what you see here is actually the shirt that is one of those fabric 1C, one of those locally produced pot shirts, but with, in this case, also decoration that has outside connections, and the same as with the production techniques itself. So the evidence that I talked about here, and I took you through very, very quickly, is that I'm not just talking about here occasional objects, about special objects, about those so-called prestige goods, and especially that these connections that we see at Suraki are not just about elite connections. These are connections that involve the entire community, but not in a random way or in a sort of homogeneous way. Notably, I also want to emphasize that these connections include other aspects than just pure material culture. It's the dietary preferences, which is the local continuity there, but elements of animal husbandry and of agriculture, and artisanal practices that are coming into as well. And if we bring in, refer back to Monteprama, it is drawing on local traditions, but transforming those through ideas and through engagement with other people. And this is more just than somebody trying to imitate a pot that they have seen elsewhere. It's actually evidence of substantial and ongoing coexistence and collaboration, practices and people living together and working together as well. And we can begin to see in this way with that adopting these innovations is neither random nor directed by or even reserved to local elites. Those dietary preferences, those involve the entire community. Everybody sort of prefer to eat their beef rather than switch to mutton. But the same is probably true for the preferences of that new fabric that you see on the slide here, which is much more Phoenician looking. But interestingly, this innovation presupposes the adoption of new techniques by local potters. So it's actually elites might have been involved, but it is local people doing this work. And the same, that's what makes the ditch such an interesting element. Building the large ditch around the nuraghe in association with a much later than usual construction of the defensive wall is not something that's done by accident. It's something that involves a lot of people. It's a long-term project. It's a community-wide project. And the discussion that we need to have, and that I haven't touched on here, I'll just do that now, is that it's unclear in this case whether that would be a collaborative undertaking of a community or a sort of a top-down elite-imposed project in this case. And what's interesting of that question, without going into the merits of this question, is that thinking about connectivity in this case has us thinking about the local social and political dynamics at the site itself, rather than trying to think about some sort of big overarching picture here of the whole Mediterranean. And with that, I want to wrap up by zooming out a little bit more beyond Sardinia and Suraki, that these are questions that are being taken up by other people in other contexts and elsewhere as well. So representing the Iron Age as a period of intensifying connections or intensifying connectivity, I think that's something, in light of what I've just been talking about, is something that I support, we can all agree to, but it is, what does that actually mean? What does the sort of increased intensity of connectivity mean? And it is, rather than it being a sort of gratuitous term that actually doesn't mean very much, it is we need to look at those local contexts to try and understand much better what the consequences are for local people. And most of all, those connections is not just about precious pieces of pottery or metalwork or glasswork perhaps that's being transported from one place to another, but it actually also involves and especially perhaps the introduction of new agricultural techniques, but including new animal species and plants that are being introduced. And particularly I want to refer here to the work of Guillem Pérez-Jorda and Leonor Peña-Chocara, who've been doing sort of great work on the Balearics and in the south of Spain about the introduction of these new species and transformation of new techniques, and particularly the introduction of tree crops that we start seeing around this time as well. Again, tree crop cultivation, which is grapes, but also prunes and other and figs so come part of it as well, how their cultivation is something that's part of a different use of the landscape, different productive organization within the communities, but it sort of goes community-wide because it actually involves people working the land there. All of this, of course, does not mean at all that elites were slow in being involved, that they were reluctant to join these sort of changes. And I think the site of Monteprama, the cemetery, shows that very well. The elites were right in the middle of all of this, but they were not the only one, and they were not doing this sort of thing on their own. And what I want to suggest here, as you often hear, or at least those of us who read Phoenician and other that sort of literature, that connectivity is all about traders, and terms like prospectors or even intrepid explorers, those sort of names are being used. It's much less about that. Connectivity, I think, is much more about local initiatives, people making sense of those sort of opportunities, innovations, adopting those within a local context, and being willing to travel and to be in another context because it makes sense locally. And connectivity, and that's my closing argument, connectivity may just serve as a means to study local and social economic organization. And at Suraki, we can therefore use connectivity as a means to start thinking about community leadership, leading families, or perhaps neighborhoods within the settlement, and about the role of artisans and agricultural workers within the local community. And these are, I think, important questions for understanding. And if connectivity helps us to sort of get into those arguments, I think that's a great way of using that concept. Thank you.
Many thanks, Peter, for your thought-provoking paper. Yo creo que han salido muchos temas que podremos retomar luego en el debate, algunos centrales, pero ahora si alguien tiene alguna pregunta específica, muy específica sobre el caso de estudio, lo puede hacer, y las cosas más generales las dejamos para después.
Sí, una pregunta muy específica, no sé si se oye. ¿Se oye? Sí, vale. Sobre el tipo de nuraghe que estáis excavando en Suraki, porque me ha llamado la atención que es bastante distinta a las nuraghes más habituales de la Edad del Bronce, ¿no? Con ese círculo bastionado. Recuerda más a yacimientos fortificados de la Edad del Hierro que a las nuraghes típicas, ¿no? De hecho, hay como incluso una intencionalidad estética, ese círculo tan perfecto con los bastiones a intervalos regulares, cosa que no es tan habitual, ¿no? En los nuraghes más antiguos, y era por si esto también podría ser un resultado de esa conectividad.
Sí, hay un montón de detalles que hablar, pero como ves bien en esta planta, es esta concepción muy regular. Normalmente estos antemurales, estos muros defensivos, son más orgánicos y irregulares por esto. Y es la datación también, o sea, finales de 8, inicio del siglo VII, es lo único notar. Y también tenemos unos debates con compañeros sardos que tienen unos problemas a aceptar esta fecha. Pero también es la verdad que la mayoría, casi todos, más de la mayoría de los antemurales nurágicos en Sardinia no están fechados bien en detalle. Y también pienso que hay más variedad, porque hasta ahora la presentación de la arquitectura nurágica es muy evolucionista. Son un torre, más torres con un muro, y con los muros estamos en el bronce final, y después hay los asentamientos sobre todo. Pero esto hecho, sí, Suraki es un yacimiento, una construcción excepcional en este sentido, y por eso también la conexión con Monteprama, las distancias son 15 kilómetros,
y no hay este suraki es el único nuraghe de este tamaño en toda esta zona, y por eso es imposible a comprobar que los muertos, porque suraki, Monte Brahma es solo un yacimiento con solo estas tumbas y las estatuas. No hay solo torres aislados en esta zona, pero es imposible en este momento comprobar que los otros yacimientos están conectados. Es difícil suponer que no hay ninguna conexión entre los dos. Y esto, por esto, en un contexto colonial que se va a desarrollar, que desde Monte Brahma son 15 kilómetros hasta Suraki, pero son 10 kilómetros en la otra dirección donde estará Taros. Y Taros, hay una primera, es poco claro para la ausencia de calidad de las viejas excavaciones, pero esto, como presencia colonial, hay materiales fenicios del siglo VIII, pero una presencia de un asentamiento no antes de mediados o también finales del siglo VII. Y por eso somos siempre en este periodo del siglo VIII, VII, cuando hay estos cambiamientos. Y entonces hay un contexto, o sea, colonial, fragilbolete, y sí se puede discutir qué significa colonial en este sentido, pero hay una interacción siempre más intenso del siglo VII. Y sí, la presencia de las características de este lugar y de esta antigüedad hacen parte de todo. También se puede, por esto no es el caso ahora, pero la presencia de estos miniaturas de lugar que son siempre de estos periodos, y esto también es una representación, pero esto es otro debate.
Había dicho preguntas en plural, pero las limito al singular. Muchas gracias, Peter.